I'm standing in a place that shouldn't exist anymore. The world around me has changed, empires have risen and collapsed, science has rewritten reality, and borders have been erased and redrawn again and again. But here, nothing moved. No progress. No reform. No escape. This colony was warned. They were given chances. And they refused every single one. To understand how this place sealed its own fate, you have to go back to the moment where survival was still possible. When this colony was founded, it wasn't meant to fail. In fact, by the standards of its time, it looked disciplined, unified, and stable. The people who settled here didn't come seeking chaos or freedom. They came seeking order. They wanted predictability in a world that felt increasingly unstable. Clear rules. Clear authority. Clear answers. And from the very beginning, this colony made one thing unmistakably clear: change was not a virtue. Consistency was. The laws, customs, and beliefs established in its earliest years were not treated as temporary solutions. They were treated as permanent truths, rules that didn't just govern behavior, but defined identity. To belong here meant accepting that the system was already complete. Questioning it wasn't curiosity. It was disloyalty. At first, this rigidity worked. The colony functioned smoothly because everyone knew their place. Leadership was centralized. Decision-making was slow but deliberate. Traditions were preserved with almost religious precision. While neighboring societies experimented, revised, and adapted, this colony stayed exactly the same, and for a time, that stability looked like strength. Outsiders even admired it. In an era of rapid change and uncertainty, the colony appeared calm. Predictable. Immune to the chaos beyond its borders. But stability can be deceptive. Because the same rules that create order can also create a trap. From the outside, the colony seemed united. From the inside, conformity was enforced not through constant violence, but through pressure, social, moral, and institutional. There were right ways to speak. Right ways to work. Right ways to think. Deviation didn't always bring punishment, but it always brought consequences. Careers stalled. Families were isolated. Reputations quietly dissolved. Over time, people learned that survival didn't depend on being right, it depended on being aligned. And alignment meant obedience. Leadership reinforced this mindset relentlessly. Decisions were framed not as choices, but as continuations of an unbroken tradition. Any suggestion of reform was portrayed as an attack on the colony's very foundation. If the rules had worked before, they would work forever. That assumption became the colony's core belief. What makes this dangerous is that it didn't feel extreme to the people living inside it. It felt logical. Responsible, even. Why change what already works? But the world outside the colony didn't stop evolving. Trade routes shifted. Political alliances changed. New ideas spread beyond the borders. Other colonies adjusted their laws, restructured leadership, modernized their systems. Some failed. Some succeeded. This colony watched all of it, and did nothing. Not because they were unaware, but because awareness didn't matter. Inside the colony, change had become synonymous with collapse. To adapt was to admit weakness. To revise the rules was to confess that the founders might have been wrong. And that was unacceptable. So instead of adjusting, leadership doubled down. Rules were clarified, not reconsidered. Enforcement became stricter. The boundaries of acceptable thought narrowed just enough that most people didn't notice, until they found themselves on the wrong side of it. The colony didn't stagnate overnight. It hardened. Each year, flexibility became more dangerous. Each generation was taught that survival depended on preservation, not progress. And slowly, almost invisibly, the colony crossed a line. There was no longer a mechanism for change. No legal pathway. No political process. No cultural permission. The system had become self-sealing, designed to reject any force that threatened its original form. That's when the first warnings arrived. They weren't dramatic. They didn't come as ultimatums or invasions. They came quietly. A request to update a policy. A suggestion to modernize a process. A signal that the outside world was moving in a different direction. Each one was dismissed. Not angrily. Not fearfully. Just ignored. Because from the colony's perspective, nothing was wrong. And when nothing is wrong, change feels unnecessary. By the time leadership acknowledged that pressure was building beyond their borders, the colony had already locked itself into a single path. A path where adaptation was impossible, and refusal was automatic. They still had time. They still had options. But they had already made their most important decision. They chose to remain exactly as they were. And from that moment forward, the outcome was no longer a question of if, only when. The warnings didn't arrive all at once. They came slowly, quietly, almost politely. At first, the outside world didn't demand anything from the colony. It simply changed around it. New standards emerged. New systems replaced old ones. What had once been normal became outdated. Most societies adjusted instinctively. Laws evolved. Institutions restructured. Traditions were revised to fit a new reality. This colony watched all of it happen from a distance, and chose to stay exactly the same. The first real warning came disguised as cooperation. An external authority requested small updates, nothing radical. A procedural change. A minor reform. A symbolic shift to align with the modern world. From the outside, it looked reasonable. From inside the colony, it felt dangerous. Leadership framed the request as a test. Not of capability, but of loyalty. If they gave in now, what would stop the next demand? And the one after that? So the answer was no, not loudly. Not defiantly. Just no. The outside world responded with patience. Another request followed. Then another. Each one slightly more urgent, each one harder to ignore. Inside the colony, leaders reassured the population that nothing was wrong. They insisted the pressure was temporary. That the world would eventually adjust back to them. After all, it always had before. But something was different this time. Other colonies, once similar in structure and belief, began to change. They adopted new systems, revised their rules, and re-entered the global conversation. This colony didn't. And for the first time, it started to fall behind. Trade slowed. Influence diminished. Opportunities quietly disappeared. None of it catastrophic, just noticeable enough to cause discomfort. For some, this sparked questions. Why were others adapting while they weren't? Why did survival elsewhere require change, but not here? Those questions didn't last long. They were labeled dangerous. Leadership responded not by addressing the concerns, but by tightening control. Rules were enforced more aggressively. Dissent was reframed as sabotage. Loyalty became something that had to be constantly proven. The message was clear: if you believe in this colony, you do not question it. Internally, the cracks widened. Younger generations, who had grown up watching the outside world evolve, struggled to understand why adaptation was treated as betrayal. Older leaders, shaped entirely by the original system, saw compromise as surrender. The gap between generations wasn't just cultural. It was existential. The colony stood at a crossroads, and refused to acknowledge it was even there. Then came the warning that couldn't be ignored. An external ultimatum. Not violent. Not immediate. Just final. Adapt your systems, or be isolated. This was the moment where survival was still possible. Change didn't require abandoning identity, only updating the rules that governed it. Other colonies had done the same and survived. Some had even thrived. But inside this colony, the ultimatum triggered panic. Not because it was impossible to comply, but because compliance would destroy the illusion of permanence. Admitting the need for change meant admitting the founders had been wrong. And that was unthinkable. So leadership chose isolation. They framed it as strength, as purity, as proof that the colony could stand alone against a corrupted world. For a brief moment, that narrative worked. Isolation became a badge of honor. Hardship was reframed as sacrifice. Loyalty was measured by how much discomfort one was willing to endure. But isolation doesn't freeze time. It accelerates decline. Without adaptation, systems began to strain. Resources became scarce. Authority weakened as promises of stability rang hollow. People noticed the contradiction. The colony claimed perfection, yet demanded constant sacrifice. It promised order, yet delivered uncertainty. Quiet dissent turned into internal resistance. Not rebellion. Not revolution. Just refusal. Refusal to comply blindly. Refusal to pretend nothing was wrong. Leadership responded the only way it knew how. With force. Rules were enforced more harshly. Surveillance increased. Punishments became visible, not to correct behavior, but to send a message. This wasn't governance anymore. It was fear management. By the time leadership realized the system was failing, it was already too late to fix it. The colony had spent so long rejecting change that it no longer knew how to implement it. The mechanisms were gone. The trust was broken. And the outside world was done waiting. The final pressure didn't come as an invasion. It came as abandonment. Trade stopped. Recognition disappeared. Support evaporated. The colony was left alone, exactly as it had insisted on being. And only then did the truth become impossible to ignore. Standing still wasn't preserving the colony. It was killing it. In the next phase, there would be no more warnings. Only consequences. Collapse doesn't always look like chaos. Sometimes it looks like silence. There were no alarms when the end began. No single moment people could point to and say, that's when everything fell apart. Life in the colony continued, at least on the surface. The same rituals. The same routines. The same declarations of strength and unity. But beneath it all, something had shifted. The outside world was gone. Trade routes that once brought resources and ideas had dried up completely. Communications stopped. Recognition vanished. The colony still existed, but no longer mattered. Isolation, once worn as a badge of honor, became suffocating. Without external pressure to adapt, internal weaknesses began to surface rapidly. Systems that had relied on stability started to fail. Bureaucracies slowed. Resources became harder to manage. Authority weakened as leaders issued the same promises they always had, only now, no one believed them. The colony had preserved its rules perfectly. But the world those rules were designed for no longer existed. As conditions worsened, loyalty fractured. Not dramatically. Not all at once. People didn't revolt. They withdrew. Participation dropped. Compliance became reluctant. Trust eroded quietly, the way stone wears down under constant pressure. Leadership responded with familiarity. They blamed external enemies, even though there were none left. They blamed internal weakness. They blamed individuals for systemic failure. Anything except the rules themselves. But fear stopped working. Punishments lost their power when survival became uncertain. Threats rang hollow when there was nothing left to protect. The colony had built its identity on control, and now control was slipping through its fingers. At this stage, reform was no longer an option. Even if leaders wanted to change, they couldn't. The structures that might have allowed adaptation had been dismantled long ago. Flexibility had been trained out of the system. What remained was inertia. And inertia is lethal in a changing world. The collapse didn't arrive as destruction. It arrived as decay. Services failed. Authority fragmented. Local power replaced centralized rule. The colony began to break apart from the inside, not through violence, but through exhaustion. People stopped believing the future could be different. And once that belief is gone, no system can survive. In its final years, the colony existed more as an idea than a functioning society. Leadership still spoke in absolutes. Declarations were still made. Traditions were still performed. But they were empty. What had once been certainty was now denial. Eventually, the colony faded from relevance entirely. Not conquered. Not liberated. Simply left behind. The world moved on without it. What makes this story unsettling isn't how dramatic it is. It's how familiar it feels. The colony didn't fall because it was evil. It didn't fall because it was ignorant. It didn't fall because it lacked resources or intelligence. It fell because it refused to change. Because it treated identity as something fragile, something that couldn't survive adaptation. History often celebrates those who stand firm. Who refuse to bend under pressure. Who hold the line when everything else shifts. But it rarely talks about the cost of standing still. Because standing still feels safe. Until it isn't. This colony believed preservation was survival. But preservation without adaptation is just slow self-destruction. In the end, no one forced the colony to collapse. No enemy stormed its gates. No disaster wiped it out overnight. It chose its fate, one decision at a time. And by the time it realized what that choice had cost, there was no longer a future left to save. The colony that refused to change didn't disappear suddenly. It simply became irrelevant. And then, it was gone.